Welcome to the Kuyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode number 122. It's been a while since we've had an episode. I took a little hiatus over Christmas break and New Year, but we are back and we have with us Jesse Sumpter. Jesse is a teacher at Logos School. He's done some writing for the Fight, Laugh, Feast magazine. He writes for Kuyperian Commentary, and I'm really bringing him on here to talk a little bit about his book, A Short Introduction to Abraham Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism. So a couple of years ago, our men's forum at our church read through Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, sort of the introduction most people have to Kuyper. And I was using Jesse's book here as a guide to help lead the discussion. It's a great book, just short chapters, and each chapter corresponds to one of the lectures that Kuyper gave, and they draw out the main themes. Jesse, you point out there are sort of three main themes in his book, and we can get into that in our conversation. But the three key ideas are that Christ is Lord of everything, that Calvinism is a life system, and that there are spheres of authority, sort of this idea of sphere sovereignty. So welcome to the podcast, Jesse. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It's great to be here, and appreciate getting to chat with you.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about why we should read Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism today.
Yeah. So basically, this is one of my interests in writing the short intro was just that I thought more people need to be reading these lectures, and reading Kuyper, I think, is encouraging, and it's a breath of fresh air for our time in understanding, particularly, as you mentioned, the lordship of Christ over everything. So Kuyper was fascinated, interested in everything. His life is he lived this theology. He was into politics. He was into education. He started a college, university, all these things, and he was into writing, of course. And so reading him, we see that he is recovering something that I think we've actually lost. So if you look back at the 20th century and leading up to our own time, in many ways, there was this misunderstanding of God's sovereignty and God's calling on Christians to be active and engaged in society. And there was sort of this retreat that occurred in the 1900s, where Christians are pulling out of various social situations and kind of ending up in cul-de-sacs rather than actually going out and building culture. And I think some of that had to do with theology and eschatology and so on. But Kuyper is not doing that in his time. So, and he's living in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So he's seeing the rise of modernism and evolution and that sort of thing. And so he's fighting against those things. And even it's interesting, he in his time is seeing what's going to happen in our own time. At one point, I reference a quote. He talks about modernism. Modernism won't be satisfied until it makes men into women and women into men. And you're like, wait a second, what? This is 100, 120 years ago or whatever. And you're like, wait, he saw transgenderism that far out? Like, that's wild. But he did. And but this idea of God's sovereignty, that Jesus owns everything, drives us to be engaged in different institutions. And that's what we see in the lectures here. He's talking about art and music and politics and these things, where rather than retreating, he's encouraging Christians to get engaged and be active. And he's giving us practical principles on how to do that well. So that's I think the main idea why people need to be reading Kuyper and getting into his teaching, his theology.
Right. I like, that's one of the things I like most about him is his confrontation of sort of Darwinism, the materialist evolutionary mindset. It was a little unusual at the time because a lot of even Orthodox Reformed theologians were happy to sort of sit in their theological ghetto and say, we have the Bible, you have science, and you do your thing. And he insisted that no, if the Bible's true, then this is false, and it can't be true at the same time. So one thing I appreciate about him is that commitment to we're going to apply this to every aspect of life.
And he saw how that Darwinian evolution, that idea of selection, was problematic because it's this materialistic worldview, disconnected from Christian theology. So Kuyper in his lectures sets up two alternatives, right? You have either selection, natural selection, Darwinian evolution, or you've got God's sovereign election. So if God is choosing his people, saving us, redeeming us, and he is sovereign over everything, that transforms how we understand the world versus Darwin's understanding of selection, where we're just atoms bouncing around, just the natural world, materialistic world. Because in that world, it's might makes right, right?
Right.
Whoever's, and that's what I mean. You can get that, the survival of the fittest. And Kuyper sees no, that's completely antithetical to Christianity. That is contrary to God's grace and mercy in the world. And so that has impacts for everything. I mean, one great example is education. Kuyper talks about education, how important that is. But you get after Darwin and evolution, you get various behavioralism and think about Skinner and his the Pavlov's dog experiment, right, where you ring the bell and the dog salivates, right? And that's basically what education becomes if we live in a materialistic world. It's here, I'll ring the bell and the students will perform for me. And that's not Christian education. Christian education, because that in Darwinian education, that's indoctrination, that's propaganda. In Christian education, it's developing Christians and immortal souls in understanding who God is, what his world is, how to live well in the world according to his law, and to be fruitful and faithful and to shape culture. And like these are the things that Christian education really is about.
Right. And that really comes out in sort of Dewey's ideas about education as well, is that you're trying to create a functional member of society. You're making a cog for the machine, something that's going to keep the wheels going, versus, as you said, you're tending to this immortal soul. You're growing something, and you're awakening a love for the true and the good and the beautiful, which is different from that behavioralist, determinist mindset of, you're a machine and we're going to find the right methodology to program you correctly for our society.
Because that actually
we see today, I think, in public education for the most part.
Yeah, that actually undermines and ultimately guts education of its true power, right? Is that if you get rid of God and you're just, because like Dewey and others are saying, we got to aim at the student and we got to understand his abilities and form the curriculum around him and his interests. That's where you get like various activities about, like, go build a TP with the child, and so that he can understand how to build a TP. And it's like, okay, yeah, because he's interested in those things. He's not interested in Latin conjugations or whatever. Right. It's like, well, no, but if you aim education at the student, you actually lose everything in the world, because the student isn't as big as the world that God has made. And so you want to actually shoot for and have a high standard. And the only way you have that standard is to have God be the standard and his word be the standard, which means that we have to shoot higher than the student, and we have to expand the student and show, no, actually there's more to the world than you. And we're not aiming at you, we're aiming at glorifying God. And that's a massive project. And that's how you maintain a good, true education. Because I mean, now we're at the place where, oh no, if the students' feelings are hurt, then we can't give them any bad grades. That would be bad for them. They would suffer from that. And it's like, no, you actually need to grade them on a real standard and apply God's standard to everything we talk about and teach.
Right. And that's really the grounding of the Christian vision of a university, which was one of the greatest creations of the Christian Middle Ages, right? The university was a completely new concept that said everything's connected, all of intelligence, knowledge, wisdom can be brought together in one place. And universities today have to have safe spaces, because ideas might hurt us if we hear an idea that doesn't suit us. And universities today are segmented into various branches of professional certification, is really all it's about. So even there, it's expanded beyond sort of school to university to life in general. This idea that everything's catered to me and what I like. Give me a class on Twilight and YA fiction, and don't teach me Shakespeare.
Taylor Swift.
Right.
Taylor Swift, right?
Give me a class on Taylor Swift.
That's what Harvard, right, recently came out with. They've got a
yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So what principles do Christians get from Kuyper that are going to help us combat that, push back against that?
Yeah. So again, the first one is God's sovereignty over the world. So again, encouraging us to get involved and be engaged, and then recognizing, because you have Kuyper is famous for popularizing and teaching on this idea of spheres of government or spheres of authority. That allows us actually to push back on what's happening in our own time. So the spheres, you have the family, you have the church, you have the state, and each of them has their own authority and calling, and they come from God, and they answer to God. And all these are built on the primary, the first place, which is the individual and self-government, which comes from God ultimately. So the heart has to be transformed and changed, and you have to practice self-government. And if you have self-government, then you can operate in these other spheres as well. But this allows you to push back on other spheres that are encroaching. So going back to education, Kuyper, in I think, a very insightful way, attacks how the government has overreached and gotten into, like, in fact, infecting science, right? Where and this is, I think, through education now, where
Right.
scientists have to be, if you have a university job, you're supported by the government, by the secular state, and they will manipulate what sort of science is allowed and what's not allowed. And Kuyper attacks that. He says, no, that's actually how you shut down science. True science needs to be it needs to be independent from the state. It needs to be honoring to God. So there are principles for it to follow, but it needs to be able to actually do its investigative work and discovery work apart from the state manipulating it and incentivizing and that sort of thing. So that's an example of that. But those spheres are important to be able to push back. Say, oh no, the state, you're not supposed to be in education. That's actually supposed to be the family's job, under God's word. The church is called to the word and the sacraments to disciple the people of God, and so that allows you to solve some of these issues that you see, and have the principles to be able to see what's wrong in our time, and what's at fault.
Right. I remember one of the things Kuyper said. It's been a couple years since I've read the book, but it stood out to me that he actually goes directly after Marx, because Karl Marx said that all of life must be politicized. Everything is political. Everything is under the purview of government. And he said, we need to create a sharp divide between society and government. Government is a very small slice of what your life should be. And you're right. There's nowhere you can go today where the government hasn't encroached. Science. I saw a meme that said something like 95% of researchers find that they agree with the person funding their research. Something
those poor 5%.
What do you know, right? What do you know?
Yeah.
But as Christians, we're not living under the government as the highest authority. We're living under God as the highest authority. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah. So and that's key for everything. So Kuyper, again, each of the lectures, he covers different topics. So I mentioned science and art. He also talks about the church as well. And this is again, he's very robust in understanding Protestant theology. Again, he's lecturing on Calvin and taking, I think, some of Calvin's theology and kind of applying it all over the place. But one of the things he's pointing out is that Christians live their lives coram Deo. Coram Deo is the Latin phrase, in the presence of God, and that is a fundamental idea for Kuyper from Protestantism, because that then pushes back on these ideas of that we need to go through somebody in order to gain true knowledge or true access to God specifically. So you'll see in the medieval age with the Roman Catholic Church that you have to, go to your priest in order to get forgiven of your sins, or you have to go through the bishop or archbishop or pope or whatever to get to God, and
or
Kuyper,
even through prayer to your patron saints, or to the Virgin Mary to get to God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Kuyper says no, Protestantism rightly understood, no, that's all wrong. That's idol worship, and that actually our one mediator is Jesus, and that's who gives us access to God, and he is God. And so we are right there, and living our life in God's presence shapes everything. So and that actually gives us the overarching authority to appeal to in all of these spheres. So in the family, something's going south or wrong in the family, you can appeal to God. You can appeal to these other governments if you need help. The church, the state, so on can step in if there's a problem, but only if there's a problem. But God's over all of it. And so again, think about the encroachment of the state and how massive the state is now. Individual Christian can actually push back and say, well, no, God's word actually says this. The state is supposed to do these things, and that's it. You don't have a say here, or what you're doing here in the state, you're actually doing that wrong and correctly. Look at God's law. And this is something that Protestants have understood. I mean, this is what built actually America, was Christians saying, well, here's God's law, and this is how we should live. And then they applied that to their lives and to society and to the civil government.
Yeah, I think Christian politicians have for a long time gotten used to prevarication, where they say, well, in their mind, they know this is God's law, we have to apply it. But when they speak into the microphone, it's got to be this roundabout process of we've got to somehow say the right thing, get to the right conclusion, but we've got to show how we got to it by this roundabout way. One of the things I love about, Dusty Devers, for instance, is he'll come right out and say, this is what God says, this is what we're going to do. And people lose their minds over that. The idea that you're not going to even pretend or offer a pretense of religious neutrality. It's really refreshing, though.
Yeah, no, it is. Well, but I mean, but I think there's a misunderstanding about, like, they think, oh, this means we're gonna well, they think we're threatening like jail for them, and it's like, no, actually, we're threatening you with life. We're like, this is the way to live, actually, guys. This actually makes things go well, and it's like, if you want to fly a plane, you actually need to follow certain rules. Like, people know that in a lot of the practical, like, day-to-day things. I mean, that's what we're talking about, and this is true in the moral realm and the civil realm as well. You have to follow these laws, otherwise it doesn't work.
These theocrats want to deny people their God-given right to flap their arms and jump off a cliff, right, and fly like a bird. So how dare they?
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I remember. I'm not a fan of Kierkegaard, but I went through a phase when I was like a freshman in college where it was really edgy and cool to read lots of Kierkegaard.
Everyone does that.
And one thing he did say that I liked was he had an image of two men standing in a king's throne room, and one of them kneels before him and does him homage, and the other one stands there and tries to argue that he exists, right? Tries to prove that the king standing in front of him exists. And Kierkegaard says, one of those men is doing the right thing in the presence of the king, and the other's not. And I think a lot of us today in the modern Christian world are the other guy. God is here. He's with us right now. He's present. And instead of acting like he is, we act like, well, maybe he is, maybe he's not. We're going to try to prove that he is, as this hypothesis. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point to make.
Yeah, well, that shapes then, like, again, everything. So again, Coram Deo, that shapes everything about how we live, and because it shapes how we do education. It shapes how you live in your family. It shapes how you worship. Because again, I think we've now the church as an institution is particularly designed to for worship and for sacraments, preaching the word, and so on. But we don't leave that behind when we're living our day Monday through Saturday. It's no, actually, we take it with us. We go with with God's blessing on our lives, and he is there watching us, and it's actually refreshing because, again, Kuyper, that's a way of pushing back on this materialistic evolutionary world that makes everybody a cog, and it impersonalizes, depersonalizes the world. And much of the 20th century, if you look at various philosophers and others, and you look at postmodernism, people are alone, right? If there is no authority over us, then we end up being very lonely, strangers in a world that we don't know. Like, he basically, Francis Schaeffer talks about this, where in this modernism and postmodernism, we end up as little, trapped people in little cocoons that can't reach out to other people, can't even touch other people, because we don't actually know if they exist or not, right? And so it's like, well, what a shallow and sad place to live, where no, actually, Kuyper, in this really winsome and powerful way, refreshes for us the personal element of the world, that God is invested in creation. He's interested in creation. He loves his people. And so everything we do is in his presence. And it's not like he's, this, Scrooge in the sky trying to zap us or something. It's
Right.
like, no, he's there as a heavenly father, and he's excited to see what we're doing, and he's encouraging us, and he wants to, cheer us on to the next thing. And that's something that Kuyper's big on also, is that there's so many fascinating things about the world to discover and to learn. The world is a massive place, and so we should be motivated to get out there and roll up our sleeves and dig in and explore and discover.
Right. Yes, it almost does give us back the world, everything, and that's one of the things I remember first reading it. You expect there to be a chapter on theology, which there is, and politics, but just Calvinism in the future, Calvinism and art, Calvinism and science. Those are all surprises, I think, a lot of times to us. Even architecture. He talks about, the one sort of failure he sees in the Reformation theology, the Reformation heritage, is we've never developed our own architecture. The first Reformed churches were just in the cathedrals that had already been built, but then as the Reformation continued, there was never this is Reformed, this is Calvinist architecture. I guess Dabney did his best. He tried, but he never got anything started. You guys are right out there in Moscow. You're building your great cathedral.
Some of that. Well, and part of it is looking back and not rejecting tradition. So we don't want to throw out everything. And so a lot of the idea here with building church buildings is imitating what was already good in the past, right? But I still think there's more there. I mean, that's where, again, looking at the future, like what is possible. And recognizing where we are in time, right? We're watching, Western civilization crumble, and there's going to be a rebuild project. I mean, we're sort of starting to sow the seeds there of rebuilding. But I think looking ahead, a really Christian view is to recognize that, I mean, the medieval cathedrals, while they were massive and amazing and just wonderful works of art, if we're really Christians, of the way Kuyper is encouraging us, we should say, that was just the beginning, right? We're actually looking ahead. We're actually going to build even better buildings than that, right? Like, and maybe there's things that, and understanding God's sovereignty in the world, that maybe there's things that need to be done away with, that actually, he's shaking things up with modernism, postmodernism, and the decline of the West, that actually there's things that need to die here in order to really make the amazing cathedrals that we're going to be making in 500, 800 years from now.
Right. What do you think some of those things are?
Some of the things that need to be done away with or corrected or that sort of thing. Yeah. Well, I think
put you on the spot. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I'm just gonna think out loud here a little bit. I mean, it seems that there is I guess, one of the things that Kuyper pushes on is, I think there's some, rationalistic elements in, and this comes from the Enlightenment, right? That the Enlightenment has really impacted us, and Christians are not against reason. We need reason in its proper place, but I think the Enlightenment has impacted us. I think there are parts of Christianity, particularly Reformed Christianity, that are very heady and don't have an understanding of beauty. I mean, that's where Kuyper is really refreshing, is that no, actually, we need to have this understanding that we are embodied creatures, that God cares for the world and he cares for beauty. And so I think some of our Enlightenment, I mean, that's where the modernism, postmodernism, if you have to describe it, is basically it's reason destroying itself. And I think sometimes, while reason is great, I think it does need to be put in its place, and we're learning that lesson in a big way, right?
Yeah. I mean, modernism made the promises that it couldn't keep, and postmodernism is basically the angry reaction against that.
Yeah.
With nobody asking, were those reasonable promises to begin with? Can you throw out God and still have all this good stuff that you want to have? So absolutely.
Yeah.
As far as the future, Kuyper is very postmillennial in his outlook. I find that, and this is my experience, there are certain circles that really like Kuyper. Our circles like Kuyper a lot. He's given sort of a nod and a smile by a lot of Presbyterians, but I think his optimism, his postmillennialism, is a barrier for a lot of people. And as we look at the future, how is the church going to rebuild civilization basically as it crumbles around us. I think that's absolutely key, is to have that post-millennial outlook, to even be able to say, maybe we're still in the early church. Maybe we still have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years to go before Christ returns. Let's get busy. How do you see that as an aspect of living out sort of a full-orbed, reformed, Calvinistic worldview?
Yeah, I think that's fundamental. I mean, the way that you tell the end of the story, or even just our time here before the end of the story, how you tell that story shapes how you understand how you're going to live now. I mean, the pre-mill dispensational theology has shaped so much. I mean, thinking like in politics, for example, you can find conservatives who are conservative in terms of politics, but then they're like, well, we're just here for a few more years and Jesus is probably going to return any day now. So, it's sort of there's we're in a leaky lifeboat, but who cares? Eventually somebody's going to come and save us. And it's like, well, actually, no, if this is actually the boat we're in, and this is what God's called us to, we need to dig in and actually the reality is, God's at work and he's doing great things here. And so we're called to do the same as well. So it really does shape how you live now, how you understand the future, and understanding that ultimately, Jesus wins. That his command to go disciple the nations is not a wins, not an empty command. It's one that's true, that he commanded it, and we're going to fulfill that and disciple all the nations, and we're just beginning to do that, really. So I think that's seems like some of the hope looking forward is actually, America and the West is crumbling, but hopefully it's a launching pad to actually do really great missionary work in other countries, and claim China and India and the rest. So,
right. Well, Jesse, thanks for coming on and spending time talking to me here on the Kuyperian Commentary. It's been great to have you here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, this has been good. Thank you.
Yeah, and for those of you watching, if you've never read Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, you really need to read those. You can get it in many different editions online. But as you're reading them, you should also get Jesse's book, Short Introduction, to guide you on your trip through that. So thanks for watching. Everybody have a great week.